John Stossel.
Capitalism works. In my lifetime, free markets have lifted 2 billion people out of the misery of poverty. And yet, lots of Americans still sneer at capitalism. It's unfair. It's a scheme where the rich exploit poor people. Even today, when I would think the success of capitalism is so obvious, some countries still turn to forms of communism. Venezuela voted for that just 15 years ago. Hugo Chavez promised higher wages, more power to the people. And voters believe. They voted him into office twice. Cuba went communist 60-some years ago, and progress there basically stopped. Cuba's almost as poor as North Korea today. But the dictators in Cuba say, we're only poor because the Yankee imperialists starve us. They're talking about America's embargo on trade with Cuba and travel to Cuba, and now President Obama proposes to end that.
We will end an outdated approach that for decades has failed to advance our interests, and instead we will begin to normalize relations between our two countries.
It's about time, say many of us libertarians. Embargoes rarely work. Our embargo just gave the Castro brothers an excuse. They could blame the capitalists for the failure of communism, and the Cuban people suffered needlessly. But plenty of Cuban Americans say it's just wrong to end the embargo. These protesters call the president a traitor. And plenty of Republican politicians oppose ending the ban. Senator Marco Rubio says we should strengthen the embargo. Ted Cruz says Obama's appeasing our enemies.
Right when the regime is struggling, President Obama stepped in to throw an economic lifeline. And I think that presents a serious danger to our national security.
Author Umberto Fontova agrees with Cruz and Rubio. Umberto was born in Cuba. He escaped when he was 7. Tom Palmer of the Atlas Network says this is one time where Obama is right. The embargo hasn't worked. Let's end it. Umberto, I think Tom is right. It hasn't worked. What's the point?
It is not an embargo at all. Last year, this was before the Obama moves, 3 times as many people visited Cuba from the United States as visited in the 1950s.
But they cheat. They go to some other country first.
Now, if you want to include those, it's probably 10 times as many. This is perfectly legal, John, with licenses.
All right, Tom, he says this embargo just isn't tough enough. And if it were, what? The Castro brothers would be gone?
No, if everybody joined it.
I don't follow this at all. You've almost made my case for me. This embargo is not about getting rid of the regime, which was what we were told when it was imposed. It's a failure. It's a policy failure, and it's time to get rid of it. It actually strengthened the Castro regime because their failures are not because of an embargo, but they have an excuse. It's the evil Yankees. They can trade with all the rest of the world.
But the Cuban people don't believe that excuse.
This is a failed policy.
Here's how Hollywood portrayed Cuba and Castro's revolution.
It was not so long ago that Cuba, the pearl of the Antilles, was a different kind of country. Her hotels a mecca for carefree tourists who flocked from around the Western world. An influx of pleasure seekers that contributed millions to the island's economy. Then Castro came, and the sounds of joy were submerged by the sound of shooting. Castro convinced the Cuban people he was their liberator, and they freely gave him the reins of government, a free hand that he betrayed when he announced he was a Marxist, dedicated to making the island a communist state.
That was Hollywood before Michael Moore and the left took it over. Tom, they really made it sound like pre-Castro Cuba was this paradise where tourists from.
I don't think that's accurate, but there was a big difference between pre and post-Castro. If you tried to leave Cuba, they did not sink your boat, they did not strafe you, they did not murder you, they did not imprison you for attempting to leave. And that really is a big difference.
Batista, the dictator, was a bad guy who favored his cronies. It wasn't real capitalism.
No.
You got out when you were 7 years old.
Right.
What happened?
We're going on the plane. We're getting ready to board. Me and my mom, my brother, and my sister. They dragged my dad off, and my mom, you know, she's figured he's going to the firing squad because that's where everybody was going in the days. And she says, okay, we're not leaving the country. We're not leaving. If you can't come, Umberto, then I'm not going to let you. My dad turns around just before he goes to the door and he said, you are leaving because whatever happens to me, and he thought he was going to the firing squad, I don't want my children growing up in a communist country. So we came to the United States.
What happened to your father?
He hunts and fishes with his children every weekend now. He got out a few months later.
Well, that's
We had a happy ending, John, but hundreds of thousands of Cuban families did not have happy endings. It's been a terrible. You can sit on any street corner in Miami or Union City and hear horror stories much worse than mine.